Hey class, today I'm going to teach a short lesson on domain and range of functions, specifically functions that don't have domains that are all real numbers. So we're going to start with this first graph here. And the first thing you need to know is that domain is going to be, domain is going to be the values of x values that are on your graph. And range is going to represent the y values on your graph. So if we look at this graph here, the x values go kind of from here. If you look at this starting point, and then this side of the graph has an arrow, which means it's just going to keep going left and down forever and ever. So if we think about all the x values on our graph, they kind of go all the way forever and ever to the left. When we write our domain, there's a couple different ways we can write this. We can say, well, the domain is all values of x that are less than 1. Or we can write that the domain goes from negative infinity all the way to 1. Now, if you notice, I didn't include the value of 1 in my domain. And if you notice, that's because this point here is open. When you have an open circle like this, it means that that point isn't actually part of your function. So when x equals 1, you notice that's an open circle. That means we don't want to include 1 in our values. Now the range of the graph are the y values. So if we look at the range, it's going to go from, you kind of want to think about how far up is it going to go and how far down is it going to go. It's only going to go as far up as y equals 4. And then again, because this arrow keeps going down forever, this function has a range that starts at 4 on the y-axis and then just keeps going down forever and ever and ever. So we can write it as y is less than or equal to 4, or we can write it as negative infinity all the way up to 4 with a square bracket. Now notice we included the value of 4, unlike when we were doing the domain with the value of 1 for x, because y equals 4 exists. It's not an open circle. It's not a hole in our graph. And so we want to include 4 in that range. Now, if we look at the next problem, we have a different function. And this one doesn't have arrows at the ends. So if we look at the domain, the farthest left that this function is ever going to go is when x is negative 3. The farthest right that the function is going to go is when x is 1. And all the points in between those are included. But if you notice again, this point here is an open circle, which means that x value is not included in our domain. So I can say that this domain is all x values between negative 3 and positive 1. We are going to include 1, but not include 3. Another way to write this in interval notation would be negative 3, comma 1 with a square bracket at 1 to show that we're including that value of x. Now for the range, we want to think how far down and how far up is this function going to go. Now we can see the function's going to go as far down as negative 4, but the upper limit of our graph is a little tricky because we do have this open circle here when y is 0. But if you look at this point here, y equals 0 exists. So even though it doesn't exist at the open circle, y equals 0 does exist somewhere else on the graph. So we do need to include that value of 0 in our range. So our range is going to be y values between -4, it's as low as it goes, and up to 0. We can also write this as square bracket -4, comma 0 with another square bracket to show that the values of -4 for y and 0 for y do exist on our graph. Another thing I wanted to mention is when we're doing interval notation, which is, let's see, this one and this one, interval notation, the intervals do need to go from lowest to highest numbers. So you need to pay attention to the order of the numbers that you write. Okay, last example. And if you want to pause the video now and try it on your own, that might be a good idea. All right, so for the domain, we want to see how far left and how far right the function goes. So all the way to the left is going to be -3, and to the right is going to be +3. Notice that this one is an open circle, and this one, I'm not sure why they made it green, but that looks like a closed circle to me. So we're going to include that point, but not the +3. So our domain is going to go between -3 and 3, and we want to include the -3 and leave the +3 excluded. Interval notation would be square bracket -3 to +3 with a rounded bracket to show that that +3 is not included. And for our range, we want to know how low does it go. And again, remember this point here, which is our lowest point on the graph, is open. And then how high is it going to go? So for our range, the lowest value is going to be y equals -1. And notice that is an open circle, so I'm not going to include -1. And y goes all the way up to the highest point on the y-axis, which is 2, and that is included. Another way to write that would be -1 with a rounded bracket, comma 2 with a square bracket to include that value. And that's it for domain and range. Please try the Desmos activities on our course calendar and then go for the homework. Bye.